Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this is the third webinar of the Inspire Europe project. And today's topic is mobility within Europe for researchers at risk. I'm very grateful to the panelists and to you, the participants, for joining us today under what I know are very difficult circumstances. And indeed, we can't fail to recognize that there is a huge disconnect between the topic of our discussion, the question of mobility within Europe, and the situation we find ourselves in today with the unprecedented restrictions on mobility that are now in place right across Europe and indeed the world to slow the spread of COVID-19. But nevertheless, we're looking forward to brighter days and to a time when such restrictions, we hope, will no longer be necessary. And so today we'll discuss the mobility rights or rules and regulations within Europe for researchers at risk, including those on temporary work permits and also those with refugee or other protection status. So before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to take the opportunity to invite all of you to get involved in the Inspire Europe project. As many of you know, today's webinar is part of a series organized by Inspire Europe, and this is a 10-partner EU-funded initiative to support, promote, and integrate researchers at risk in Europe. And these include researchers who are at risk in their countries of origin due to discrimination, persecution, suffering, and/or violence, or who are seeking refuge out of these reasons or have recently found refuge in Europe. And at the moment, the project is undertaking broad consultations with researchers at risk, as well as with employers and host institutions across Europe. And we're encouraging all webinar participants to participate in the Inspire Europe questionnaire. There's a link on your screen to that questionnaire, and many of you will already have received that by email, of course. It's a questionnaire that was developed by the European University Association, EUA, as part of the Inspire Europe project. So please visit our website to find that. Now, turning back to today's webinar, I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists. First, we have Ms. Hélène Kahlers, who is Policy Officer in the Legal Pathways and Integration Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs. Ms. Kahlers was involved in the negotiations of the Students and Researchers Directive and is now responsible for the follow-up and implementation of that directive and the Seasonal Workers Directive. So thank you, Hélène, for joining us. Our second speaker will be Dr. Stephen Hawks, who is a lawyer specializing in refugee and migration law. He is a lecturer at the University of Gießen in Germany, where he teaches asylum procedural law within the framework of the Refugee Law Clinic. So what we'll do is begin with a presentation from each of our expert panelists for about 7 to 10 minutes each, which I know is a challenge given that this is a huge topic. But then straight away after our presentations, we will open a question and answer session. And so all of you who are participating in the webinar, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button, and you will be able to submit questions there during the webinar, and then I will moderate those questions and field them to the panelists once the two presentations are over. The presentations generally will cover, first of all, an overview of the 2016 EU directive on the conditions of entry and residence of third country nationals for the purpose of research and its relevance to researchers at risk in Europe. And then we'll also have an overview of the rules and regulations and implications of mobility within the EU for those with refugee status or other protection status. And again, any implications for researchers at risk moving between EU states. Just one note on anonymity and security. So once you, if you hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, if you wish to submit a question, there is an option to submit your question anonymously. And in order to do so, you just need to tick a button. So I would urge you to do that so that then your name is not shared with the panelists when your question is asked. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. I'm going to turn now to invite Hélène Kahlers from the European Commission to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I will share with you my presentation and start. So indeed, as Sinead said, I will mostly present the Students and Researchers Directive, or as we call it, but mostly from the point of view of researchers. Sorry, I think now it just a sec. There. So this directive was adopted in 2016 and is in implementation since 2018. What does it cover? It covers 25 member states, so all EU member states except Denmark and Ireland. Ireland keeps on applying the previous Researchers Directive of 2005. It covers non-Europeans, so EU citizens, but also, citizens of the Schengen area and etc. are not covered by this directive. This directive also excludes all the rules I'm going to talk about right now, exclude asylum seekers, refugees, and those under temporary protection. They're excluded from those rules. Why? Because their regime is regulated by other rules that the next panelist will present in a few minutes. It covers application from outside the European Union. So for those who are currently who are residing when they apply in a third country, or already from the European Union, if they are residents. So meaning if they have long stay visa or residence permit, they can apply for a permit or long stay visa under this directive. And member states have also the opportunity to allow application for applicants with a short stay visa, but it's only an option, so it's not compulsory on member states. And it covers researchers who will carry out research in private or public research organizations. So it's quite wide in its scope as regards the research which will be carried, where it will be carried, and etc. So in order to apply under this directive, to get a visa or a permit, depending on the member state, you need a certain number of documents. So you need an hosting agreement or a contract with the research organization where you will work, a valid travel document, proof that you will have sickness insurance in the member state, proof of sufficient resources. The level of sufficient resources is defined by each of the member states. And member states have an option to also ask for the address in the member state, fees to be paid for the processing of the application, and possibly a written undertaking by the research organization that they will keep, well, that they will be responsible for costs and etc. during the stay. What type of rights are available based on this directive? Where there is a possibility to teach in addition of carrying out research, so without additional permits or requirements from the authorities. There is a right to equal treatment with nationals of the member state concerned in a number of areas, including working conditions, including social security, access to goods and services, etc. There is also a right for family members to accompany the researchers, meaning that the application has to be dealt in parallel with the researcher for family members who wish to accompany the researcher. This means partners and underage, so under 18 children as a rule, and member state may allow for other family members to accompany as well. It also means that there is a right to intra-EU mobility for research purposes. So meaning in the framework of the same research project or research that the person is carrying out in one member state, they can go to other member states to be hosted by different, by other research institutes. For example, if they need to go for 6 months to another member state to do some research there as part of the project, this is possible. With some formalities, but which have been limited compared to the original permit. And once the research is completed, so at the end of the research project or research activity, it is possible for the third country national to stay in the member state, so in the same member state where they had the permit, for 9 months to look for a job or set up a business. So member states have gone further than the 9 months, but the minimum required under the directive is 9 months. So you can find more information on the EU immigration portal and the different rules in the different member states, though I have to say that the portal is currently being updated, so the information may not be up to date. We're working on it at the moment so that it will be updated within this year, and we hope this will then be easily accessible. So as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these are the rules for that can apply to researchers at risk if they come to the Union or if they are already in the Union, not under a refugee status or an asylum status. And I will give the floor back to the presenter, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Hélène. I'd like to move straight to Dr. Stephen Hawkes, who is a specialist in refugee and migration law, for his presentation, and then we'll open the floor to the participants for your questions. Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, you're currently on mute. Can you?
So,
there we go.
Good. So you can see that. Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm talking about the mobility of researchers at risk in Europe from the perspective of a lawyer who's dealing with refugees, not in the first place with researchers. So, but some of my clients meet also these criteria. So I'm talking about the reasons why can a threatened scholar be in Europe, and the reasons why he or she can be here can be under two different regulations. We have the international protection under the EU directive, which is valid for all people who are fleeing for reasons like for persecution and seeking for protection in Europe. And we have the possibility to be here as a researcher under the directive Hélène has just explained us. There's a third situation, a scenario I can imagine, that is that people come here to work and to have a work contract. They don't come as a researcher, but they work they are in working contracts with institutions, and that could be a third way. So we have so you see in we have two ways. To come to Germany for refugee status and subsidiary protections are have to be explained. Refugee status follows the status under the Geneva Convention. Subsidiary protection is a more or less invention of the European Union and covers all other situations in which people flee a country either with respect to a war that is taking place, or because they are victims of torture. Yeah, let us see how that develops for the people within Europe once they have reached Europe. And the point is, let us talk in the first place about the international protection. We have the problems, first of all, that there is no visa regime provided for. So people who want to come because they are in danger in their home country, they don't have a right to come under the protection rules, which is a major problem, of course. And we all know that, and we know the consequences that take place in the Mediterranean Sea and some other places. So there is no access under the law. Then there are the other issues like the Dublin regulation, which is a European regulation that is determining which state is responsible for refugees. So there is no choice of the person, him or herself, to choose the state where she or he wants to be. Then there is another burden, that is the recognition. You need a recognition by the federal office, which is true for all European countries, that there are some offices in Germany, it's the federal office. And if you fail the recognition, you have the danger of deportation. And what is true of all that is, and that I can mention that here, and Helene has also mentioned that before, there is no access to the START directive, which is the directive Helen mentioned, the directive for students and researchers. And they have been excluded. Other refugees and people who apply for the refugee status have been excluded from this directive. So that's really important. If you choose to apply for asylum, you have to be aware that you are automatically excluded from the directive, the START directive, which is a real problem. And if you go the other way, you want to have to go to, as a researcher, then you have that is already, I can just repeat that what Helen says, you have to apply for a visa, you have to present the hosting agreement, and what is a really good position under the regime of the directive is that you have a claim. So which is something for technical reasons, which is a really advantage, because the immigration office has no discretion about that case. So once you have presented the hosting agreement and you have met other requirements, then you have a right, a claim to get the visa for the time of your being a researcher. And coming back now to the issue mobility within Europe. If you are a researcher under the EU directive, you have the rights of moving, as Helene mentioned. So there is no visa within the Schengen area. You have to distinguish between Schengen area and other parts of the European Union. So if you are in the Schengen area, then you have easily the right to access other European or Schengen countries, and then you may then apply for a visa there as a researcher without leaving this second country. So you can straightly from the spot apply. That is it's an advantage because under this directive. If you work as in a labor agreement and you don't take advantage of the directive, then we have the same situation. People may travel within Europe and within the Schengen area, but it might be a problem to generate, to apply straightly from the spot to a work visa, because these provisions don't fall under the directive. And yeah, coming back to the main issue here, I would like to point out this point here is, if you are a refugee and have receiving international protection, then you have no access to the START directive, which makes it a bit more difficult because you have to apply for other kinds of visa if you want to work in other countries. And for people who failed to be recognized under the protection directive, so people in the case that, for instance, the federal office does not see your case amounting to a serious case of persecution, then you have only the right to stay in a situation as a tolerated person. And in this situation, the mobility is like nothing, because you don't have the access to other countries of Europe, and you don't have the access to the START directive. So this is a really poor situation that can develop. So in the end, what we do is we try to advocate people who are in danger and who want to come from abroad to go through the through the EU directive and help them to find to go through the visa procedure, but which is something what Sinead mentioned is in these days very difficult because the embassies are closed and visa applications are not being processed. Yeah, so far from my side. So I'm happy to answer your questions, but I would like to ask a question to Helene later. Maybe this is possible, but this for me right now.
So thank you very much to Stephen and Helene. I can see that we have lots of good questions coming in. So also Stephen and Helene, I would just refer you to the Q&A button so that you can follow those as they come in as well. It may be the case that I'll need to group some of these if they're of a similar theme. Maybe first of all to say that we will be sharing the PowerPoint presentations with people who have joined this webinar. They'll be available on our website shortly after today. And we will also be recording this webinar, and that will also be available on the website. So you'll be able to share that further with anyone you think might be interested in this topic. So let's begin to go through some of the questions that have come in. There's a first question from a researcher who is asking if we can provide some points about moving after 1 year at Scholars at Risk. So my understanding of this question is we're talking about someone who is not in the refugee or asylum seeking process, but who is rather in a 1 year temporary position at an institution and then wants to move to another European country as that 1 year is drawing to a close. And so, of course, many of the responses here are going to be on a case-by-case basis, but I will at least field these questions to the experts who will tell you what the various options are within the existing frameworks. So Helene or Stephen, would you like to address that question? It's quite a general question.
Yeah, Helene.
Yeah, sure. I can try. Indeed, the question is a bit vague, maybe. I mean, whoever is, I'm guessing we're talking already somebody who is in the EU, because the question is not so clear, but I'll take that as a starting point. So if the person is already a researcher in a member state and wants to apply for a position in another member state, then the procedure that I've explained can be applied. It's a question that indeed one of the requirements of the Students and Researchers Directive is to already have an hosting agreement, so meaning, or a contract, meaning that you need to already have a position in the member state where you want to apply to go to. So that's one of the requirements. If it's a question about moving, because maybe there was also some, maybe misunderstanding about what we call mobility. For me, there are two different types of mobility in the EU. One is the mobility under the directive, meaning that it's mobility in the framework of a research project for the purpose of research. There is, of course, always the possibility within the Schengen area to move to go and visit friends for general, either tourist purposes or even to go for an interview, for example, to go to another member state on the basis of the permit or the visa that you have in the first member state. So for me, those two types of mobility are different. Maybe that wasn't clear enough. So the rules applying to both are also different. You can go to, indeed, for 2 weeks to another country on holidays to visit friends, to take an interview on the basis of the permit that you have. This is the normal Schengen mobility. what, Stephen, I think you are sharing still your screen.
Okay.
What is different is if you are mobile within the framework of your research project, and then it's the rules of the directives that apply, meaning that indeed, if it's part of your research project, then you can go for well, for either less than 6 months or even more than 6 months, then the rules are a bit different, to another member state under the framework of the directive. And there I have to point out that this does not follow the Schengen rules, in the sense that it's all the member states which apply the directive. So it's the 25 member states that I've mentioned. So it doesn't take into account the Schengen, non-Schengen member states. So this mobility under the directive is also valid from a non-Schengen member state to a Schengen member state. For example, a researcher in Romania can go to do 6 months in a research institute in Germany, or the other way around. A researcher in Germany can go for 4 months or 6 or 7 in Romania under the researchers directive. So this is also something to keep in mind, which is a bit complicated, I know, but it's the difference between the normal Schengen mobility and the mobility under the directive. I hope that answers generally the question.
Thank you. And you wanted to add something, Stephen?
Yeah, I understood that the person in question we are talking about is receiving the benefits of a protection under the Geneva Convention or subsidiary protection. Was that the question? I guess
it's not clear. The question is more general. So it
okay.
and I think it's maybe, Stephen, what I might do is just there's a second question that's very similar, asking, can I move from a university in Norway to Germany? How do I do so? I am a scholar at risk in Norway. So I think it's along the same vein. Somebody who's not within the asylum seeking process, or who does not hold a subsidiary protection, but who is rather on a temporary work permit, moving from one country to the next to take up a new position. Did you want to come in on that, or should we move to the next?
No, I would like to just express that if this person has already received a protection or is seeking for a protection, then she or he is excluded from the researchers directive. That is the point. So if this person has a restricted or a limited stay permit because of humanitarian reasons which have nothing to do with the protection, then it's not a problem to move. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I can also answer that question from a point of view of someone indeed who isn't an asylum seeker or beneficiary of international protection. Norway is not covered by the directive. So if you want to move from Norway to Germany, you would need to apply for a permit or visa in Germany, Germany, so to the embassy or the consulate. If you want to apply under the directive, the condition that I've listed would apply. So that's it. But yeah, Norway is not part of the directive. Therefore, it's not the mobility that I've mentioned before. It's a brand new permit for Germany.
Okay, exactly. Yeah, Norway. It's a very bad example for that. For my,
Okay, let's move on to, we have quite a few questions coming in, so let's move through them. I understand that 9 months are provided to look for work after the research is completed, but the question is the 9 months extension of stay possible even if the permit expires?
Yes. Sorry. Actually, most member states, in general, you should apply for this extension of 9 months before your permit expires. Some member states put a deadline, so either, I don't know, 30 days, 60 days, or etc. before the permit expires. But it is possible to apply, of course, the permit for the research permit will expire anyway because the research program will finish. But it is possible to apply for this permit. The conditions are quite limited. You need to actually provide proof that you finished the research. So it's usually a certificate from the research institute. You need to prove that you will still have sickness insurance, and you need to prove that you have sufficient resources. Again, sufficient resources based on the amount which the member state has defined. And this extension is also valid for family members. So meaning that family members also benefit from this 9 months extension together with the researcher, of course, if the conditions I've mentioned are fulfilled.
Great, thank you. This next question is for you, Hélène. It asks, what is the recourse if the right to equal treatment is not upheld?
As in general for EU law, well, infringement to EU law, the first recourse is national courts. So on the basis of the directive or on the basis of the national law, which should have transposed the directive, you can go to the national courts if the right to equal treatment is not upheld. If you think that actually it's a problem of transposition of the national law, so meaning that the national law is not in line with the EU law, you can always also table a complaint to the European Commission that we will then have a look at, but be aware that procedure of complaints to the European Commission usually take a while and do not aim to solve individual problems. They aim to sort out the issue of the transposition of the national law. But of course, it's always good that we in the Commission know if there is a problem in the national law. But the first recourse is always national courts, which are competent depending on the matter, if it's a working condition matter, if it's access to goods or services, or etc. It might be different courts responsible at national level.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. This next question is from Switzerland. It says, if you are accepted under START status, can you come to Switzerland in the Schengen area for a mobility period?
If by mobility period we mean, or the question means for parts of the research activity or project or etc., the answer is no, because the directive does not cover Switzerland. So Switzerland does not apply the directive and therefore does not apply either the mobility provision of the directive. The normal Schengen rules apply, meaning if the researcher wishes to go on holiday, to even go to a library in Switzerland, this would be possible under the Schengen mobility, because the residence permit in the first member state, in the member state of the permit, would allow then Schengen travel. But if the person wishes to stay for a while and to work in Switzerland, then they would have to apply for a residence permit or a visa in Switzerland.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. This next question I think is for you, Stephen. It says, is it possible to travel in the Schengen area without having a passport? I only have a residency permit, but not a valid travel document.
No, that is not possible. We need to cross a border. We need a passport. Third countries member need a passport. Europeans just need a ID card, but so it's not possible. And that is a really huge problem for people who come as a refugee, because they don't have a passport. And another thing that could happen, and I heard that from some clients who were from Turkey, their passports were cancelled by the authorities, and from this day on, they had major problems, even if they were here as researchers, and then they had to think about move from the one track to the other, to move from the researcher's track to the refugee track, because they didn't have a passport.
Mm-hmm. On this same vein, Stephen, there are a couple of other questions, so maybe we'll ask those to you as well. One says, I am in Germany at the moment and applied as a refugee, but my application was rejected. I have a PSI, so this is a Philip Schwartz Initiative scholarship, but I have to stay in the city while I need to take part in some events in Europe, but I have no right to do that. Are there any rules around this?
Of course, yeah. Generally spoken, no, there is no way, because you need a passport and you need a permit. As Helen said, if you want to have a permit to stay in one European country, you have within the Schengen area the right to move. So this would be a wonderful solution for for these people. But if you are rejected and you don't have this permission, then you are not allowed to leave Germany for a conference, for instance. But the only thing could be that you apply individually for a solution with your immigration office, and sometime, if you have good reasons and you could explain that, how important that is, you could get such a document just for for 2 weeks, just to travel to the conference. But I would say that this is very unlikely that you get that, but you should try.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question, Stephen, in a similar vein. I am in Athens. I have no passport and no travel document. A German university has accepted me, but the German embassy does not have any appointments. I sent an email to the embassy, but there is no reply. Do you have any advice in this situation?
Yeah, it depends much on the status that of this person. If this person has, in essence, a permission status, then it would be easy just to travel. But I assume that this person does not have anything like that, but is a refugee waiting for I don't know what to wait for the procedure. Then it's the same problem as I mentioned before. There's no chance, unfortunately, without going to the embassy and receiving a visa from there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a situation, someone who is not in the refugee process. Can I settle in another European country without having a passport? I am a PAUSE laureate in France, so that means they're in receipt of a fellowship from the PAUSE program at the Collège de France. I am not a refugee. My scholarship will be over in about 5 months.
May I just point out one thing? Not having a passport is not the end of the story. You may apply for a passport by the authorities where you live. They can issue passports for those people who are not eligible or have no way to get one passport. So we have to discuss why this person doesn't have a passport. Maybe they can be helped by that she applies for a proxy passport, passport by the local authorities.
Mm-hmm. And in that case, Stephen, where would be the first port of call for someone in that situation?
The court. Yeah.
No, where would be the first where would be the first resource that they would go to if they're in that situation? When you say the local authorities,
they should contact the authorities, because they are eligible to issue aliens. I don't know the English expression, like alien passports. So if you are coming from a country that don't issue passports to you, and you can come up with good reasons for not contacting them, even if you are not a refugee, then you might get such a passport, and you have to discuss that with your local migration authority.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can answer that since I'm French. The first point, I mean, the responsible authorities in France are the préfecture. So that would be where you would need to go to ask for something like this. And indeed, well, under the directive, it doesn't say that you need a passport. It says that you need a valid travel document as defined by the member state. So it does not necessarily mean, as Stephen said, it can be an alliance document, etc., which is issued by a member state in case there is no way of having a passport. But the discretion is left to the member state to decide what they consider a valid travel document.
Thank you. This next question is more general, and it might be for you, Hélène. If a researcher wants to apply for a visa in Ireland and Denmark, how does this work?
So for maybe I'll take Denmark first. It's easier. Denmark does not apply the legal migration acquis, so the EU acquis in the field of legal migration. So everything regarding legal migration to Denmark is regulated only by national law. So you would need to check the rules in Denmark, the specific rules for that. Ireland is in a bit of a different situation because I didn't go into that much detail in my presentation, but actually before the current directive, so the 2016 directive, there was a previous directive that was adopted in 2005 regulating researchers, and actually Ireland applies that directive, which is only now applicable in Ireland, because in all the other member states it was replaced by the 2016 directive. So in Ireland, the rules are still the rules of the old 2005 directives, which are actually, with regard to researcher, very much in line with the current directive. So you would also need an hosting agreement, you would also need sufficient resources, you would also need proof of sickness insurance. So the rules are more or less the same in that regard. The rules that are different are the rules about mobility, because the mobility scheme under the old directive was different. So then with regard to mobility, the procedure might be heavier than what it is under the current directive. But as regards condition of admission, the rules are more or less the same as what I have explained.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. There are some questions that people are also submitting about funding for positions and also about the availability of positions. I need to skip over them in the context of this webinar because we can answer those in other fora, but while we have the experts available on questions of mobility, we're going to stick to that theme. So this one is for you, Stephen. It says, hello, I'm a scholar at risk in Germany. I applied for asylum in Germany 1 year ago, and I still have not received an answer. Is it normal to wait 1 year to receive an answer?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, it is, because given that we have many cases in Germany running, it is very normal that you have to wait such time. But maybe you can write to the authorities and ask for the reason, and maybe you get a soon answer.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of the average time, Stephen, at the moment?
It depends a bit on the when you applied in the first place. So it's a very funny that very young applications, fresh applications, are processed in a very fast way rather than old ones. So it could be that you're waiting for 3 years. It depends on the time. We had many refugees in 2015 and 16. So if you applied at that time, it could be taking longer than if you just apply these days.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a question preceding that question that I think is directed more at the Inspire Europe project. So I'll just respond to that quickly. It says, what about those in the UK with refugee status? Are they still supported through Inspire Europe? So maybe just to clarify that Inspire Europe, of course, welcomes participants who are anywhere in the world. We have a focus on coordinating the work within Europe, but our webinars and events are open to researchers who are based anywhere. So there are no restrictions for those who are based in the UK and participating in these types of career development and training events. But just with regard to that question, within the UK, would anyone, would either Stephen or Hélène want to expand further on, are there any considerations given recent developments in the UK with regard to movement of researchers between the UK and other countries within the EU?
I would like to leave it for Hélène.
Thank you so much. Well, the UK, just like Ireland and Denmark, does not apply the EU acquis in legal migration. So meaning, well, because for during the transitional period, EU law keeps on applying, but it doesn't, the UK never applied the directive. So anyway, they have national rules with regards to researchers, permits, and etc. With regard to mobility of researchers, I mean, the mobility which is being discussed with EU nationals. I do not think that it covers third country nationals, at least as far as I know.
Yeah.
Okay. We're moving now to a question for you, Stephen. It says, I am a recognized refugee in Greece. Can you elaborate on the mobility restrictions that this brings along?
Okay, recognized in Greece. We unfortunately don't have the right of mobility for refugees. So we have a directive that covers people who stay longer than 5 years in a European country, and then they have the right to move under the long-term statement or directive or so. I don't know the expression of that in English. But apart from that, there's only the right that they individually apply for a visa for instance, in Germany or in another country. So it could be family reunion or a labor agreement that they can provide, can they present and have as a reason. But by being a refugee, they don't have this right to move and stay there. Yeah, of course they can travel, but they don't have the right to live and work in another European country. And as they are eliminated from the START or Researchers Directive, they cannot take the benefits of that. But of course, they can have a labor agreement with a university or with a research institute that could be work then. But it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Maybe I can
yes,
complement that. Indeed, well, the directive Stephen mentioned about long-term residence is also covered by my unit. So it's the Long-Term Residence Directive 2003-109. So indeed, it applies to third country nationals who have been residing in a member state for at least 5 years. And they can apply for then a long-term residence status. EU long-term residence status, which allow for mobility in the EU. But it is indeed available after 5 years, 5 years of residence.
Yeah. Yeah. But there is no benefit or exclusion for people who come as a refugee. Refugees.
No, yeah, exactly. On the contrary, they are covered by the LTR directive and do not lose the beneficiary of international protection status. The two statuses can be combined.
And that in the past it wasn't worth because they were excluded even from this directive, but now they can, after 5 years, move.
Great, thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes remaining, so I hope we can get through maybe 3 or 4 more questions in the time available. This one is likely also for you, Stephen. Is it possible to apply for asylum after finishing a contract of work as a scholar at risk in a European country?
Yeah, of course, you may do that. There's no restriction on that. And that is a good solution for people who really fear persecution in their home country. So that could be a way if they don't have the access to other kinds of permits. So I would, as a lawyer, all the time recommend to go these ways. But if there is no chance to get that, then you may do that and apply for asylum. And there are some, but you have to bear in mind that if the decision on your application will be negative, then you have to face the deportation. And then you have no way back because of the restrictions we mentioned. Even once you have gone the way of asylum, you are not allowed in Germany, but it's true in other European countries, you don't have the right to return to other paths. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, also on this question of what happens at the end of a placement. So what happens if at the end of a 9-month extension, no job can be found? Does the researcher and his or her family, are they forced to leave the EU?
Yes, if there is no reason for the stay anymore, the permit to look for a job is indeed valid. Well, at least for 9 months, depending on the member state. But if it expires and there is no other right to stay in the EU, in the sense of that the person applied for another type of permit or etc., yes, they will then be in a regular stay and will have to leave the European Union. Yes.
Okay, I have a helpful note here from a representative who's participating from the PSI initiative at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, who says that if the scholar that we mentioned earlier, who is waiting for an embassy appointment, if they are a PSI scholar, please ask them to get in touch with the PSI initiative, so the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, in case they can help you in this regard. Okay, another question. My wife and I have been in Germany for approximately 2 years, but we have not had a result on our residence permit from the court, BAMF. Our lawyer has inquired about the process, but she has not had any information. We have a permit to travel only in, it says only in German, I assume it's only in Germany. What can we do to travel within the EU?
Yeah, that is the same situation we had earlier in a question. BAMF is the German authorities, they deal with the asylum applications. And so I assume that these people wait for their decision. Yes, if they don't have a permit to stay and they don't have passports, but in the first place, they don't have a permit, so they are not allowed to travel within the European Union. And yeah, that's unfortunately the situation. Mm-hmm. Apart from one, of course, they could individually ask their authorities for a permit, but as I said, mentioned earlier, the likelihood is not very great that they get it.
Okay, here's a question that I think might just be a request for a clarification. What other valid travel documents are there besides a passport?
Yeah, may I just mention, there are many kinds of passports. If you have a status as a refugee, you get a passport. This is under the Geneva Convention. Then there are other kinds of passports provided for by the local authorities. And these passports are valid for all countries with the exception of the home country of the person who is the passport holder. So, yeah, and those, they allow you to travel.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question, a request for clarification, is Norway regulated by these directives? So maybe Elaine, first, assuming we're talking about the Researchers Directive.
Yeah, so about the Researchers Directive, no, Norway does not apply the Researchers Directive. So the rules that I've mentioned in my presentation do not apply to Norway. But Norway is a member of the Schengen area, meaning that if you have a residence permit or a long stay visa from a member state of the Schengen area, you can go to Norway for short-term travel, not for work, but for short-term travel in the sense of the Schengen area.
Okay, this one, Stephen, will be for you. It says French authorities indicate that the only way to obtain a valid travel document is by claiming political asylum. But would I be able to settle in another EU country after getting my refugee status? I am told that refugees cannot leave the host country for a period of 2 years.
That is, I have never heard about this 2 years rule. Of course, you can leave the country, but it depends on the reason you can present to get a visa in another country. So this is the main issue here again. So being a refugee itself does not help you to move and to live in other countries, but you can seek for a reason, like being a researcher, being an employee, or being a family member. There's one issue that is that maybe your passport expires from a time. That could be happen, but the time period for expiring of your passport is very long. So I think yes, you can once being a refugee leave France for other countries, under the visa regime of the other country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so maybe, Stephen, you could say something about what the implications would be if someone with refugee status left the first host country to take up a position elsewhere, what the implications would be for their residency in that first country.
Yeah, being a refugee is nearly the same as being somewhere else. So you need to come up with a reason why you exactly have to be in the Netherlands, for instance, if you are recognized in France. There could be the idea that you again apply for asylum in the second country. This is not possible. This is something what is not possible. Once you apply a second time for asylum and you are recognized, for instance, in France, then you will be rejected for this reason. So there is only there's the scenario of a refugee status only for one European country. So this is the point. But you can, as I mentioned, if you have a labor agreement with an institution, or you have other reasons to live in this other country, you can move.
Maybe I can complement on that. Indeed, since the person would not fall within the scope of the Students and Researchers Directive, then national law applies. Yeah. So meaning that they could, well, depending on what the provision in the national law are, they could indeed get a permit as an employee or etc. But the national law would apply and not the Researchers Directive because of the exclusion mentioned.
That's a good point, the national law. So it's, as I said, it's the same as if you're in India and apply for a visa for Germany. It's for a refugee in France. It's the same situation. Mm-hmm. But the one advantage she has is she can just move over and travel to the other country and seek for a job, for instance. Yeah.
Okay. We have 2 minutes remaining. So what I wanted to ask of both Hélène and Stephen is if you would have advice. So given that people won't have access to both of yourselves for follow-up questions, what are the best resources for people to turn to if they have questions about any of these types of issues we've discussed today? Could you maybe talk us through some of the possible avenues? Of course, as part of the Inspire Europe project, part of our role is to develop kind of signposting and resources so that people know where to turn if they have more detailed questions in this regard. And we'll be sharing the recording, as I said, of this webinar, and we also share news and resources on our website. But just if you do have any practical advice right now on where people might go for follow-up questions.
From my side, it's, well, the website that I've mentioned, so the immigration portal, where you can find information per member state, per category of migrant or of status. As I said, it's being updated, but you can already find information, and if the information that you can find on it is not complete or does not answer your question, we also have on that website links to then the national authorities responsible and to the national web pages which address those questions. Another way would be for researchers, the EURAccess network, which also which actually aims to provide information to researchers specifically. And if they are faced with questions they cannot answer, they usually are redirected to us. So you can also use that that channel for information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Stephen?
Yeah, difficult. I only know about local sources. So the Philip Schwartz initiative provides for a website in which some questions are dealt with. But apart from that, if once you are in Europe, you should talk to your local authorities, to lawyers, or to organizations who deal with refugees. So there are many, many organizations who are doing that.
So including, for example, refugee councils and
yes,
immigration authorities in the host country.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to thank Hélène and Stephen very much for joining us today from your homes under these exceptional circumstances. We're extremely grateful. And to you, the participants, for joining as well. We'll be sharing the recording of the webinar, and we really would welcome your suggestions for topics for future webinars. We intend to hold at least another 4 or 5 specifically targeted to assist researchers at risk. So we really want more of your suggestions on what topics would be useful. Anyone who has participated in the webinar will receive a link to the recordings and to the website where we are sharing further information about future topics. Thank you so much again, and thank you to our panelists again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.